Four parables in our series, ending with counting the cost. And so we're looking at two or one, depending on how you count them or group them, here in Luke 14. I'd like to consider these with you tonight. Hope you've had a good day and a restful day. It's been such an encouraging time, both this morning and this afternoon in Keith's class, and now this evening as we worship together. So I want to take just a moment to kind of get us situated in the text, right? Because these parables that Jesus tells, again, they're not just dropped randomly into any context. And so we've studied much of Luke 14 before. In fact, the parable of the guest and the chief seats precede this parable, or these parables, that Jesus begins in verses 25 through 35. And what Luke 14 is all about is Jesus exposing illusions people have about the kingdom and following him. So if you go back to the top of the chapter and you think back to verses 1 through 6, that's when Jesus is in the house of a leading Pharisee, right? And that's when he challenges them about healing on the Sabbath, right? So you have all these critics surrounding Jesus, and what he exposes there is their lack of mercy, right? Because he says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And they won't answer him. And that's when he gives the response, like, if you've got an animal that falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you're going to go get him, right? And so he's exposing there, confronting them, how they're very good at appearing religious, but they never show any mercy or kindness, no matter how desperate people are among them. And then come from that comes the following parable next, as you continue reading about the chief seats that we've studied, right? That where he exposes pride that wants to be number one, right? He's observing the people. They want the seat of honor in the house, and they want the reward, right, of that recognition and influence, and they use it as a means to feel relevant, right? And then he goes on to talk about hospitality. He says, if you give a feast, invite people who can't pay you back, right? Instead of inviting those who you know will invite you in return. Don't use hospitality as really an act of selfishness, right? So over and over again, he's exposing all sorts of illusions people have about being acceptable before God while remaining unmerciful or prideful or appearing religious, just going through the motions. And then we get the parable of the wedding guests, or the banquet rather, where he's exposing people who make excuses when they're confronted by God. And that brings us to verse 25. Now, great crowds are following him after all that. And there's one more illusion he wants to expose. And that is, you can't follow him casually. Large crowds were going along with him, and he turned and said to them, and it's a test. I can't help but chuckle because, he's not, there's nothing to indicate here he's impressed by the large group that's following. He doesn't turn and say, wonderful, we're growing, look at this movement, right? He turns and immediately gives them a test in verse 26. He says, if you want to come to me and you don't hate your father and mother and sister and brother and children, even your own life, you can't be my disciple. He puts a hard truth in front of, right, this large crowd, excited followers, right? They're swelling behind him. And the first thing that he touches is our relational priorities leading up to these parables that are really going to illustrate what he's laying down in these verses, beginning in verse 25. The warning that he gives about our relationships and self-denial. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Right? So as the chapter unfolds, I think what we begin to see is a challenge, not only to accept the invitation and examine ourselves in light of the warning and the invitation, but to understand what accepting the invitation actually means. And the parables that Jesus tells of the tower half built and the king who's overmatched illustrate these teachings. Right? He's already said on more than one occasion, if you're going to follow me, it means unrivaled loyalty. Even above your closest earthly relationships, whatever those may be, even your own life. And these demands, by the way, only make sense if Jesus is worth more than father, mother, spouse, children, possessions, life itself. And that's exactly the point I think he wants us to see. He doesn't speak to people as just an advisor or someone who's seeking a fan base. He speaks as Lord and Savior who demands everything because he's worth more than everything. And so the question he puts to us really in these pictures is that who hears that and just responds casually, makes a half-hearted effort, or is thoughtless about it? Right, because the only reasonable response is submission and surrender. So Jesus is not calling here, despite the throng that's following him, he's saying real discipleship. It's not a burst of excitement. It's not crowd energy. It's wholehearted allegiance. And that's just the baseline. So before Jesus illustrates anything, that's what he's stating plainly. And so the parables that we're looking at, they live inside that framework that he's established in verse 26, 27. And then again, what follows in verse 33. So verse 26, you see the unrivaled loyalty. Verse 27, taking up one's cross. And in verse 33, he says renouncing everything. And in each of those cases, with each of those phrases, notice he gives a negative impossibility. He says, you cannot be my disciple, unless you do this. So pay careful attention to his wording. If anyone comes to me, if anyone comes after me, my disciple. When we see that first point laid down, he's not talking about, as he mentions family there in verse 26, he's not commanding sinful malice toward family. I know that you know this. We know better than that. He commands us to love our neighbors, honor our parents, be faithful in marriage. So this is not literal hatred. He's talking about not having bitter feelings, certainly not condoning that. But he's saying there's no love that can outrank him. As he puts it in Matthew 10:37, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. So he's targeting our dearest circles, the people that we want to protect, naturally that we treasure most, right? And then he ends with self. So again, he's not asking, we're saying, I want to be added. I want to be added to your life. He's saying, no, I have first place in everything or nothing, even over your own self-preservation. And no man has a right to speak that way. No prophet, no preacher, no spiritual mentor can command that kind of allegiance over family. But again, Jesus does. because he's not one authority among many. Again, he's Lord. And when those loyalties collide, and they will, in your family, in your marriage, with your children, at work, any relationship, who gets the final word in your life? Now, verse 27, where Jesus says, whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. You know, in our modern speech, sometimes we talk about our cross to bear. And how do folks usually use that expression? Oftentimes, at least in my experience, it's for, annoyances or inconveniences, difficult personalities, maybe on the job, health struggles, that's my cross to bear. What did it mean in Jesus' world? Was the cross an image of inconvenience? Well, yeah, I guess we could say that. It was a lot more, wasn't it? It was an image of execution and humiliation, to hang there without your clothes on, completely exposed, suffering, and it's an image of surrender. So Jesus he's not saying, sometimes it's going to be hard. That's not the point. He's saying, if you're going to follow me, you need to be willing from the outset to do it through rejection, through loss, and death itself. As he tells one of his churches later in Revelation 2:10, don't fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is going to cast some of you into prison so that you will be tested. You will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. I think the implication in that text is some of those Christians only had 10 more days on earth. It was going to be their last test. They were going to be, many of them, executed. But if they bore their cross to the end, they would ultimately find life. And that's what we find in all of Jesus' teaching, right? If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. That's been Jesus' call all along. So it doesn't surprise us in chapter 14 when we see it again, right? Preceding these parables. And so am I really prepared to lose status and safety and relationships and possessions, life itself, rather than turn back? And I got a little bit ahead of myself, but I want to mention this again. In verses 26 and 27, that phrase, and in verse 33, if you drop down there on the other side of those parables, you find the same message. Not verbatim. So verse 33, for example, he says, none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his possessions. And then in verses 26 and 7, it's rendered this way. He cannot be my disciple. And again, he cannot be my disciple. And the reason I want to seize upon that is because Jesus doesn't say you will be a weaker disciple or you will be a less mature disciple if you refuse this. He's not describing some super advanced level of following him. Right? If you can manage this, then you're elite. These are the basic qualities that define a disciple. And something about that struck me as I was studying this text. I know it's not news to you, it's not news to me, but I don't know. It's sobering to think about. If these terms are refused, I cannot follow him. Is it fair to say that many people treat submission as an optional category? All right, somebody said the other day in a conversation, well, you guys are weird. You're just extremely religious. So that's why you act the way you do. You're weirdly serious about this God stuff, aren't you? Jesus doesn't treat it that way. He says that is what following him is. So do I think of total surrender as, a rare path for unusually devoted Christians, or do I see it the way Jesus taught as discipleship itself? You see, he doesn't leave room for socially safe, low-cost, padded discipleship. He doesn't recognize that category where we can think highly of him, admire him, follow if it's convenient. He doesn't accept that. And so as we think about these parables, wherein he is teaching us to count the cost, before he tells the parable, the cost has already been defined. And the relinquishing of all relationships, self-sacrifice, and what he will say on the other side in verse 33, renouncing all possessions. And I think verses 28 through 32, he's calling us to reckon with the cost. Which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and he's not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, "This man began to build and was not able to finish." So let's start with a point that's easy to miss. The builder does not first build, he sits down. What does that conjure in your mind? If someone's about to give you some news and they tell you, you might want to sit down first. Right? There's a deliberate thoughtfulness that is going to need to take place, right? Brace yourself, in other words. Deliberate consideration, serious consideration needs to happen. And that matches, right, the cost that he's already laid down. He's not saying that this is a one-off, or just, when you are an emotional high and you're real ginned up. It's not Jesus in the moment. He's saying you have to recognize what following me demands. Now, he's not discouraging discipleship. But what he's saying is, I think, don't be thoughtless about it. How often can we be more careful about our business dealings and money and projects and land dealings and trades and even war than we are about our souls? We'll take time to carefully plan an addition to the house, compare truck prices when we're shopping, review insurance quotes, run numbers for retirement, but never take as much care in thinking about the cost of discipleship. What does that half-built tower mean that he's talking about? And I was growing up in College Station as a boy there. There was this massive construction project. I don't know whatever became of it, but it was on the east side of Southwest Parkway, and you could see it for miles around from Highway 6, or if you're on University Drive. And at first it seemed to go up in a hurry, right? And it was impressive. It was the biggest building at that time. This is 20 or 30 years ago. Biggest building in the city. And there was activity all around it, but over time, that activity slowly died. And I can remember so distinctly driving by as a kid, and you could see the empty windows and the sheets of plastic, just kind of hanging there, some blowing in the wind, and, leftover construction debris all around it. It was a massive building. I never knew what it was supposed to be. And it remained that way for years, even until I was old enough to drive myself. And still I could see it. So I must have driven by this thing countless times where there was never any change. And I always had the same thought all those years. What happened? Clearly something went wrong. What happened? Jesus says the problem is not merely that a man fails when he doesn't count the cost. It's that he doesn't finish. He began and could not finish. And so this half-built tower becomes visible evidence to everyone that I rushed in without counting the cost. That's exactly how many treat Jesus. Right? You think, and it's not the first time he's given us this picture, right? In the parable of the sower, you find it again in the seed that's planted in the rocky places, right? It shoots up, it's excited, they're moved, they're interested, they're stirred, they lay a foundation, right? And they begin maybe very impressively. But when the cost rises, there's tension in the family, or social shame, or any number of things, they begin to stall. And they begin to shrink back. Now here's what God says in Hebrews 10:38. My righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But the Hebrew writer gives the encouraging word. We are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but are those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. You see, unfinished discipleship becomes its own evidence against us. Verses 29 and 30. Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him. Why does he include ridicule there? Mockery. Well, because half-hearted discipleship is shameful. It brings scorn from a world that's eager to point the finger. We're happy to say, I knew you were never serious about that. Again, the problem is not that he desired to build. That's a good thing. The problem is that he began without facing the reality of what completion was going to require. But it doesn't end there, because there's another picture of the king, isn't there? Jesus goes on to say, or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. This is the second picture. Right? The builder risks ridicule, demise. The king risks something similar, also ruin, right? And the king is facing here in this picture an overwhelming reality. Right? He has to assess whether he can meet what is coming. And if not, he needs to act rather accordingly and decisively. And for the longest time, I foolishly flattened both of these parables to mean, don't be thoughtless. Seriously, count the cost of discipleship. And certainly that's here in the second picture, but there's something else going on. This man here, the king, who's not reckoning with what's on the horizon, is like the man who sees Christ's terms and just refuses to face the facts. Sees who Christ is as Lord and King, and is willing to go to war with him. And I think that's the emphasis, right? He's facing an overwhelming reality. And when that's the case, Jesus is saying it's not time to bluff, it's time to do what? You send out that delegation, you make peace. It's time to yield, in other words, while he's still far away. Ask for terms of peace. In other words, recognize that you can't prevail. So here's the only reasonable course, and that is to surrender. And so Jesus is saying we have that window now. And if you know that's the case, like that king who sees, the odds, they're 2-1 here. We're completely outmatched. You're not going to move casually toward the opportunity to make peace. And in neither case is Jesus calling us to decide whether he's worth following. He's already made plain that he is. I think he's saying he wants us to honestly consider what it means to follow him, so that we won't pretend we can be disciples, true disciples, on easier terms. And so now, having restudied this, I think that these parables are less about think carefully. They are, that element is there, counting the cost. I think they're less about think carefully and more about face reality. One man begins and is ashamed, another advances and is overmatched. So Jesus takes these two obvious earthly examples and uses them to shame and expose spiritual carelessness. It's like Jesus is moving again toward total submission. And where does he take us in verse 33? So then, none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions. This is what Jesus has been driving toward. Jesus' conclusion, like in verses 26 and 27, is surrender all. And here the point is, not literally abandon every possession physically in every circumstance, as if Christians can't own stuff, any physical thing at all. What he's saying is that I can't follow him while clinging to ownership or believing that I have final authority over what he's given me. We can know that because without going off and chasing a rabbit, there's plenty of times where Jesus and the apostles speak to Christians who, have houses and goods and money and work, and they're told how to use those things under God's rule, not just get rid of everything. There's one occasion where he does tell a man that, but that's not the same instruction here. Your Bible might use the word renounce instead of give up. And that's the idea. Understand that they don't belong to you in the ultimate sense. I can no longer live as if Christ has no claim over everything. There's nothing that I can say, but this is mine to keep, this is mine to control, mine to protect at all costs. So again, the demand is total surrender. So whether the rival authority or possession is family or self or things, Jesus says the same thing each time. If anything outranks me, you cannot be my disciple. So it's about relinquishing self-rule. And the point is not that you earn salvation by heroically forfeiting your stuff. That's not it. No, giving things up doesn't purchase Jesus or the salvation that he offers. But relinquishing and renouncing all that we have proves we understand, or we have some understanding of who he is. So do I acknowledge Christ as truly above my family, above all that I have, above even my own life? And if that sounds severe, he's still not finished. Because look at verses 34 and 35. Therefore, salt is good, but even if salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. In other words, he's given us the terms: total surrender, relinquishing of self. And then he says, what good is a disciple who doesn't behave like a disciple? That's the closing thread. Salt is good. So he says that plainly. Salt is useful. It's valuable. It has a purpose now just as then to season and preserve things. But the point here is not to chase every possible use of it. Jesus is dwelling on one thing, one point. Salt is good as long as what? It is salty. Its usefulness is tied to its nature. A disciple is good in the world. A disciple is good to Christ only if he remains distinct as a disciple. And so, what's the key distinction in the context? What is a salty disciple in this context? It's the one without mixed loyalties. It's the one who's wholly given to Christ. And salt that has lost its savor is no longer useful. It's the disciple who has lost the very thing that's made him a disciple to begin with. And Jesus says, with what shall it be seasoned? How will it be made salty again? Salt that no longer tastes like salt is fit neither for the land nor for the dunghill. Jesus says it's useless. Those are his words, not mine. So I can claim to bear his name and go through the motions, but Jesus says there's no substance. And he doesn't mince words about where such a one ends up. And he ends by telling us to hear. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. If I will not have Christ above family, above life, above possessions, above my own self, I'm not a weaker disciple. Jesus says I've become a useless one. So the builder could not finish. The king would not face reality. They're like savorless salt, fit for nothing. And this truth is for those willing to hear it. Again, Jesus will not allow me to be, or you to be, a socially acceptable, culturally safe disciple. He will not recognize a man who refuses his terms. And has he ever? Why do you call me Lord, he says, and do not do what I say? If I refuse his terms, can I expect his approval? If there's no submission, there's no savor. If there's no savor, then what remains is useless. That is severe, but it's meant to be. Because Jesus has made his terms plain. He is, again, he makes these claims because he is worthy to make these claims. He has all authority in heaven and earth. He's too worthy to be obeyed halfway or to be followed casually. And that's exactly what happens when I try to protect myself, have my cake and eat it too, as we say, refuse complete surrender. Christ is worth more than everything. So why not submit to his terms now? That's what the king should have done when he saw the army a long way off. Jesus is inviting peace. It's pointless to go to war with him. He's the one who went to the cross. He's the one whom God chose and rose from the dead and who is now reigning before whom we must all stand in final judgment. And so the terms that he's putting before us, they're not harsh. They're not intrusions. His commandments are not burdensome. First of all, they're rightful claims, and they're gracious ones. He is the crucified and risen Lord who calls us to turn from sin, to find every spiritual blessing in him, to be free from guilt, to be free from the fear of death, fear of eternal punishment, have a clean conscience, and look forward to a home in heaven with him. But it cannot be had apart from complete surrender. When the men in Acts chapter 2 realized their guilt and tried to square with that and come to terms with it, they said, what do we do? In verse 37. And they were told the same thing that Jesus says in Mark 16. Repent and be baptized, each and every one of you, for the forgiveness of sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. The King is delaying. We're overmatched. He graciously invites us into his home, his family, and into eternity. Would you not respond to his invitation while you still can? Surrender while you can. If you're subject to the invitation tonight and we can help you in some way, please come as we stand and sing.